My name is Patrice Lawrence, and it is an honour and a privilege to be chairing this session about the YA book Punch in the Air with Ibi Zoboi and Yusef Salaam, the authors. Ibi holds an MFA from Vermont College of Fine Arts. Her novel, American Street, was a National Book Award finalist and a New York Times notable book. She's also the author of Pride and My Life as an Ice Cream Sandwich, a New York Times bestseller. She's the editor of the anthology Black Enough. Born in Haiti and raised in New York City, she now lives in New Jersey with her husband and her 3 children. You can find her online at www.ibizoboi.net. Dr. Yusef Salaam was just 15 years old when his life was upended after being wrongly convicted in a Central Park jogger case, along with 4 other boys who are now known as the Exonerated Five. In 2002, after the young men spent years of their lives behind bars, their sentences were overturned and they were fully exonerated. Their story has been documented in the award-winning film The Central Park Five by Ken Burns, Sarah Burns, and David McMahon in Ava DuVernay's highly acclaimed Netflix series, When They See Us. Yusef is now a poet, activist, and inspirational speaker who lives in Atlanta, Georgia. He is the recipient of a Lifetime Achievement Award from President Barack Obama, among other honors. You can find him online at www.yusefspeaks.com. So first I want to talk about Amal. He's a Black creative, he's 16, he's a skateboarder, he's loved. He finds himself in this gentrified white area where white young men are claiming the basketball courts as their own sort of territory. And a fight ensues, which has devastating consequences on so many people's lives. So the first question I want to ask you is, what are the journeys for both of you that brought you to write this book at this time? So may I start with you, Ibi?
Well, other than Yusef's personal journey that started in 1989, I met Yusef 10 years later in 1999 in college in New York City. I had been taking a class called African Civilization. Our professor was a former civil rights advocate. She was a former member of SNCC in the 1950s and 60s, which is the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and she had worked with the late Representative John Lewis. So she was teaching these very African-centered classes at Hunter. And one of those days in the spring of 99, in walks Yusef Salaam. And the first thing she says to him is something to the effect of, "I knew you didn't do it." And she embraced him. And we didn't remember who he was. This is before social media. So many of us in the class, we all grew up in New York City. And at that time, we were all in elementary school or middle school when the Central Park Five jogger case took place. And I immediately remembered that case. And I was the editor of my newspaper. And I went after him for a newspaper interview. I never got that interview, but we ended up talking for a couple of hours. And of course, I remembered him over the next few years because I ran into him again 3 years ago, where he'd been selling his self-published book of poetry. And I thought it was unfair that he was self-published, having a unique story such as his. And this was before the Netflix series. So he shared with me that he wanted to, share his story with teen readers. I write for teen readers, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Yusef, would you like to carry on with the history?
Yeah, I mean, as for me, back in 1989, being run over by the spike wheels of justice as a 15-year-old, and then, of course, being convicted at 16 was a traumatic experience, to say the least. It was something that you really don't know the true depth of it until and unless you are one or you have loved ones that have been placed in those kinds of confined spaces, especially for a crime that you didn't commit. And so here it is, 7 years later, I come out of prison And then a few more years go by and I find myself looking for this professor. And when I met the professor and Ibi was in the classroom, you know, I still was hiding in plain sight. It wasn't something that I felt that I wanted to really be as open with my particular story, because I still had all of those indelible scars. I was still wearing those scars, you know. And when Ibi met me a few years ago and I was publishing, I mean, I shouldn't say publishing. I was gonna say peddling, but that's not the right imagery that I want to give. But I was basically selling my own book, the book that I had written, that I had used for the most part to help me get through this horrible time in my life. It was something that I could look at often and remember by reading what this struggle was all about, what I needed to keep my eyes on, which was that sliver of light in the distance that made it easier to get through this particular challenge, that allowed me to use as much of that imagination I had to be free, even though my body was in bondage. And so it was a tremendous opportunity, I think. And we tell this story kind of from that vantage point of what is it like to be falsely accused of a crime that you didn't commit? What is it like for the system to see you, but not really see you? They see their version of what they think you are. And that begins to kind of become the narrative and what plays out in the rest of this particular scenario. And really, this is a kind of a mirroring effect of what we see in society as it relates to cases just like our case, just like this particular case. And I say case, but I'm not necessarily talking about a criminal case, but I'm talking about people in general, as society has looked at Black people in particular, Black bodies in particular. We have been kind of relegated to the margins of society and therefore defined as the most violent, the ones who will steal from you, the ones who are poor, and more importantly, poor in mind and attitude and all of the things that come along with that. You know, so Punching the Air shows up really to talk about that, to have that conversation. You know, I always say we've had a front row seat to oppression, that oppression that we've seen in America through the George Floyd case, through Breonna Taylor, through Sandra Bland, Trayvon Martin. There's so many names that we have. It's like an unending story. It is what, in some ways, my great friend, my great teacher, even though I never met him, Malcolm X would say that this is the American nightmare.
Thank you. And I think I was going to ask you just a little bit more about Amal, Hope. And as I was reading it, you know, I thought for him, he was both a victim and a creator. He was sensitive. He was aware of his internal world, but also aware that he had to almost like perform identities for the outside world as well. That he was loved, he loves, but he also hates. And he understands that there's black and white, but also that there's grey. And I suppose I wondered, as you were creating Amal, sort of what conscious decisions did you both make about how you would bring him to life? And I suppose for you, Yusef, how much of yourself and your story, but also Ibi, I think, reading an interview with you as a mother of a black son and also as a witness to what happens around you, how did you decide what to bring to Amal and what to keep separate? Yusef, would you like to speak first?
Well, you know, it was pretty cool, I think, talking with Ibi, because I'm the one that would narrate a lot of what was my life and what happened in my story. And Ibi was able to take my story and the narrations that I gave her and give it a 2020 version, right? There was a lot of things that I was aware of as a youngster. You know, I was growing up in America, and my mother would always tell me that she was raised in the Jim Crow South. And I really didn't understand what she meant because, of course, if you're in New York, there's covert racism and then there's overt racism. And the overt racism is not something that you always see, but you always experience covert racism. I mean, in the Central Park Jogger case, it was clear that I was experiencing that. And a lot of the anger and frustration that I would realize and then be able to describe later on was really what we find and can put into the character of Amal. But I think more importantly is the fact that his name is a name that really dignifies him and signifies that he is the savior for his own self. They say that you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But once that horse drinks, that horse then slakes his thirst. It becomes happy and great and able to move on. And I think that that's one of the ideas that we wanted to plant in the minds and the hearts of people who read this book, that you have to be your own savior. You are the one that you are looking for. And once you realize that, you are hope.
What are things, you've got this kind of quite raw narrative and this emotion, and I noticed you added sort of hashtags and a social media in a 2020, but were there other things that you felt that maybe you had to round off or rein in, particularly thinking you're having a global audience, or did you just take it as it was? How did you shape it?
Well, I have to add that Amal is inspired by Yusef. It's not just that he is a 2020 version of Yusef. It's also that he shares similar worldviews as 16-year-old Yusef. There was a poem in Yusef's self-published book called I Stand Accused. And that poem was going to be at the beginning of Punching the Air, but it got edited out just to make the story smoother. So that poem was written by Yusef at 16, and it let me know how incredibly insightful and culturally and politically aware he was as a 16-year-old boy. And we both needed this fictional version of him to be just as politically aware and savvy. And the profound thing is that that awareness did not immunize him from the injustices that all Black people face in America and all over the world. So in terms of making it more universal, that was not our intention at all. We weren't trying to round out any edges just so white readers can empathize with him at all. This is the fact that he loves classical art is not
that actually in a moment.
It is many young people love, appreciate certain things that are not part of their culture. He can appreciate Picasso and still not see himself in Picasso. So he remixes it. I'm thinking of hip hop artists who take country songs and remix it into hip hop.
Yeah.
They have to have some sort of awareness of things, not that they have to, they already know what's out there in terms of classical literature, classical art, anything that has a white aesthetic. They learn about it in school. They can't escape that. So the genius of Black children is that how they're able to take those things that don't represent their culture and remix it so that it does, so that they can find value in it. So there's something that happens in the end of Punching the Air where Amal takes these things, these ideas that he learns as an AP art student and flips it on their head and remixes them so that they're an outlet for his personal truth. So none of that is about, trying to kowtow to white readers to make them think, oh, wow, look, he is really smart. That is not the goal there. The goal was that to make him authentic, to make him incredibly aware. Yusef, as a boy and even as a young man and as a man, is incredibly well-read. That is not fictional, that is the truth. So 16-year-old Amal is well-read in the same way that 16-year-old Yusef was well-read, and I was well-read. I am well-read as well. We wanted that sort of artsy kid to exist on the page because we know them. Those are my children. Those are kids that I worked with, and those were us as teens as well.
Thank you. I suppose I also want to ask you about some of the secondary characters as well. So his teacher, Miss Rinaldi, the white teacher who, in a sense, gave the character witness that sent him possibly into the prison. It's a bit of a reminder me of, is it Miss Morello in Everybody Hates Chris? That sense about somebody who thinks they're quite liberal, but actually has this sort of racist undertone that they don't pick up. Was she based on somebody specific, or was she representing something, a sort of white liberalism within the system? Were you saying something specific with her?
You know, I don't remember asking Yusef about his schooling, his teachers. What I did know is that he did go in an art school and a performance art school, LaGuardia High School in New York City, which was formerly the Fame School. That particular teacher was not going to be there in the book until I had an exchange with my son's teacher. My son's
reality in it.
Yes, he was in 7th grade when I was working on it, the book. And he was sick, but he wanted to go to school. So he kept putting on his hoodie and kept putting his head down on the desk. And the teacher made it sound more sinister than it really was, and even got administration involved just to let me know that he was being disrespectful by putting on his hoodie and putting his head down. I happened to know that he was exhausted. He was up all night coughing, but I told him to stay home, but he insisted on going to school. Lo and behold, by the last class of the day, he was exhausted. But it's the way that the teacher framed him in the email. And this is at the beginning of the school year, where she doesn't quite know him, right? She doesn't know us as a family, and she doesn't know him as a 12-year-old boy. And because of that, and not just because of that, because of her assumptions about him, she, attributed behavior to him that was not real. So there's a poem that Yusef likes to read from Punching the Air called Clone. And that's where we got that idea, to just and there's something that Yusef says too about the worst place a Black child can be is in a white person's imagination. So in Miss Rinaldi's imagination, Amal is all these things. In my son's art teacher's imagination, my son is all these things. And if I were the kind of parent to think that the teacher has the last say, he would have gotten in trouble. He would have gotten in trouble. He would have been punished. I would have yelled at him. He would have felt some sort of rage. And imagine if that kept happening throughout, the rest of his middle school years and on to college, high school and college, and for the rest of his life.
It's something that will resonate with many parents of color in the UK. And it's the sort of conversations that we have amongst ourselves. And I certainly remember meeting one parent before I had my child, who's Nigerian, and saying that her oldest son was in prison, but she said he's almost like her sacrifice to the system, because she believed everything that the teacher said at school. So after that, with her children, she will fight for them. And it felt almost, like a sacrifice of her son's life to believing that the system was working on his behalf. Can I also ask you then about Stanford? Stanford was a sort of curiosity in a sense that he reminded me, for instance, of in the UK where you get Black policemen. And if there's a sort of protest, they're the ones who get abused by Black protesters more than white policemen. And I wondered, how did Stanford survive in this system? Were there Black prison officers in the prison? Or were you trying to make a point about how Black people can be part of the system and sometimes find little ways to resist?
Well, if I could really chime in on that particular idea, I think for the most part, when you look at systemic issues and institutional systemic issues that deal with racism, the Black officers aren't always allowed to participate in a full way with Black inmates, because in that particular dynamic, you see the Black officer would almost take on the idea of a father figure, which is necessary. Whereas in the prison that I was in, there were a lot of officers that did take on those particular ideas in the youth facility. Now, when I got to the adult facility, diametrically different. I mean, it was like, whoa, you know, definitely a lot more white officers there. Definitely the good old boys club. To me, it as I think about it now, it's more like more of a gang kind of mentality, because there's this desire to show them. You know, I'm going to show the black people, you know, what this really is by further continuing to oppress them, you know. And I think that, you know, just from a perspective of lived experience, you know, I'm looking at that from that particular vantage point, because that's part of what reality is. That part that, you know, oftentimes we don't get the opportunity to hear from a person who's been incarcerated. But we always want to know, you know, like, what was the experience like, you know? And that experience can be a very challenging experience because you're fighting for survival, you know, and you're trying to figure out how to get through.
It's interesting, I think, also with some of the moments of kindness were the ones that made me burst into tears. So there's a big thing that was going on, but one of the moments that I did burst into tears was when Stanford left the watercolours in the cell, and that's just that moment of kindness in sort of all this harshness. The corners, the guys who are there, who sort of, in a sense, have a miles back. And it was interesting how you played with this, because it turned out, you know, it was actually also about friendship as opposed to sort of control and sides. Again, does that reflect experience, or was that something that you added in?
Well, I think that does reflect true experience, but the beautiful thing is that describing those kinds of ideas with Ibi found its way artistically on the page, right? And so the thing that we are looking at and want the reader to look at as well is not necessarily just the words and as they read it, but also the way the words are placed on the page. It becomes a bit of artistry, you know. There is camaraderie. There is safety nets that you find in spaces like that. And I think those things are necessary. You know, I think that at some point, the idea of survival becomes greater in people's minds, and they look to, so to speak, things that are familial. They look to friendships. They look to, really what I think it is they look to things to insulate themselves, you know, so that, oh yeah, when I come back out of my cell and I see someone that, you know, I've developed a certain, so to speak, camaraderie with. Not that this is about control or anything like that, but I think that that's part of the survival tactic as well. That you actually have a sounding board to talk to and to talk with, going through these kinds of things. Therefore, it makes it a difference, because it's now you're realizing that you're growing through something as opposed to just going through something.
Was it possible to trust anybody?
I think it was incredibly difficult to trust people, but the more you understood someone, the more you would trust. But you always have one eye open and one eye closed, you know. So you sleep with one eye open and one eye closed, because it's just that it's the nature of where you are, you know. I mean, and in the Black and brown communities in America, you know, we have this really kind of coolness about how we translate and transfer ideas. And so sleep is actually a no-no, right? They say we never sleep. Sleep is the cousin of death. And so it's the matter of you always on point. You're always aware, you know, you always have your head on a swivel. You're always hyper aware, you know, but then at the same time, you realize that that's unnatural. The naturalness is supposed to be you're supposed to be able to have a downtime, an opportunity where you can just, so to speak, breathe a sigh of relief and let your guards down. Because to always be on point is really to always be in a state of war. And the reality is that in America, it almost seems like that's what's true, that we're always in this state of war. We're battling against, you know, not necessarily just ideas, but this true oppression that has now become so blatant that they're not even trying to hide it.
The other two characters I was interested in how you wrote female characters as well. And I think, years ago when I was doing a master's, I was looking at Black fatherhood in films, mostly UK, but there weren't many UK films, so I went to sort of the US. And I remember watching, is it John Singleton's Boys in the Hood, and actually feeling quite frustrated by the female depictions of the female characters. But in this, you've got sort of the characters were warm and loving, and even sort of Zenobia comes back and she's writing a letter, but the way it's written, it's not like she's expected to save him. It feels quite equal. And I just wondered, again, if you thought about how women would be depicted in this. So, Ibi?
Yeah, I really had to think about how women would be depicted. I had asked Yusef straight up, how does he feel about me co-writing this with him? I'm a woman, and wondering if he would have preferred a man to do this with him. But I was really, I admired his response, just reminding me that his mother played a pivotal role in his life, not just by giving birth to him, but just when the trial happened, while he was incarcerated, after he was released. And now, I did meet his mother, and I remember his mother is active in the Harlem community. And I knew of her, even before I reunited with Yusef again 3 years ago. So for me as a mother, I had to bring my full mothering self into this project. I can't write from the perspective of I'm a boy going through this, or a man reflecting back on his boyhood. I had to think about this from the lens of a mother. And this is why the book opens up with Amal being born. And very few people point this out, but he was born at home. And a home birth, and I had 3 home births. A home birth is one of the first expressions of freedom, that a mother can impart on you. I have the option of being born at the hospital, but here's a right that I have. I have the right to give birth to you in the safety of my home. And this child is born, a mother cares for him, a mother feeds him, clothes him, takes him to school. There is love there. But there is something about our society that can easily pull that child out of the womb. And at 16, you're kind of still in the womb. You're being nurtured and reared by the people who love you. You haven't quite left the nest yet. So that sort of thing is to remind readers that he was a child in the same way that Yusef at 15 was a child. Kevin Richardson, one of the other members, was 14 and still in middle school. So as a parent, I know that a teen boy is still grappling with some basic things like hygiene, and if you're sending your son to boarding school, you prepare him in certain ways to take care of himself. So when that child is taken from you by the system, whether, he was, guilty or not, you have not prepared him for one, the basic things, and then 2, the other things that might happen to him when he's incarcerated. So it is sort of this child being ripped from your arms, so that the mother had to be there on the page. So society can remember that is part of what makes him human. He's born.
It's something actually when you talked about the sort of home birth, I connected that it was a home birth, but now actually thinking about that feels quite political when we think about disparity in child deaths between maternal deaths between different communities in hospitals. So from that moment, she's protecting him from having been birthed in her own environment and not in a hospital. So it does make it that much more, just so much more tragic, I think. I suppose now, I do want to talk a little bit about the system and about, in a sense, systematic racism, but also the sort of personal racism. And I sort of looked at the video where you sort of talked about how future prisons are planned, possibly based on the results of 9-year-olds. And that deeply sort of shocked me. But I also thought about how England and Wales, not Scotland, I hasten to say, but England and Wales, in a sense, is a reflection of what happens in America. So I'm on the sort of advisory group for an organisation called the Howard League for Penal Reform, and they're trying to put together a resource to stop over-representation of young people of colour. And I was kind of looking at some figures just before I came, and that obviously black children are more likely to be excluded in school in England and Wales, are four times more likely to be arrested than white children, more than twice as likely to live in poorer neighbourhoods. They make up probably about a third of the under 18 population, but over half in prison. So we are sort of following very much in those footsteps. But I think what's clear in your book as well is that a Miles' journey, in the book, it starts in the courtroom, but actually you go back in history, don't you? You know, you look at enslavement. And I thought, were you, again, when you wrote that book, very, very conscious that you wanted to put that timeline of history, that it does not just start when the first punch was thrown. It doesn't start in a courtroom, but it started long before that. Was that something that was always part of your thinking before imprisonment, or is it something that you reflected on during imprisonment?
Yeah, I think that was something that was enhanced during imprisonment, because one of the things that happens is that children quite often don't have the opportunity to imagine their parents as children. Mm-hmm. And even though your parents may tell you things, you still are kind of like, this is my mom, you know? And it's not until you become an adult and you have children yourself that you realize what it is that you need to be giving them. And so it dawned on me, I mean, I knew this, but it dawned on me in a very, very powerful way that even though I was going to school in America, my mother was also giving me a parallel education. That wasn't an education that caused me to buck the system, but it was an education that taught me the truth about what was going on, but allowed me to learn and understand what it was that I needed to know in order to operate in this particular system and society. And so the understanding of struggle was there. Being told that she was raised in a Jim Crow South, and here we are in New York, and the description of what that meant was there. But it wasn't necessarily seared in until prison. Then I had to do like I often call it Sankofa, where you go back and get something, but you really begin to rely on memory. You have to remember that you know these things. You have to remember that inside of self, you can even go deeper and further back than you think you can, because through the DNA is the history of your family and of struggle and of everything that we have gone through. And so I think the beautiful thing about this was that idea that this wasn't just a incident, but the incident is connected to something. And in order for you to understand the fullness of what this is, you have to understand the connectedness of it. And so, you know, oftentimes you hear people talk about poverty. You hear people talk about gentrification. In this book, we talk about a gentrifying neighborhood, because then you realize that the truth of the matter is that neighborhoods don't just shift overnight, but it happens in a way where people are there already. People are familiar with places and landmarks, and they go to different areas, even if those areas weren't necessarily created for them. And I'm going to use that kind of idea, because what happens in gentrifying neighborhoods, of course, is that the beautification comes, and the people who were already there see the new ballpark being created, the new skateboard park being created, and they want to go and experience that. They want to be able to feel that kind of niceness that happens in these beautiful spaces, you know? And then you listen as you read to the other characters who are coming. Oh, I knew something was going to happen, so I took out my cell phone. No, I didn't know this individual, but I knew that they were up to no good. All of this kind of definition or defining of a people when you've never asked them who they are, you know. And I think that part is important.
Just sort of just about the gentrifying neighbourhoods. I mean, there's that sort of reflection on what, for instance, has happened in Harlem, because certainly in parts of London, in Brixton and East London, where initially people came from the Caribbean because nobody else would rent, would property to them, and they lived in those places. And now suddenly the prices mean most people can't stay there, they have to move out. And I wondered if that is part of what is happening in your areas at the moment as well, and you wanted to incorporate that.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely happening, but I don't necessarily think that we wanted to incorporate that because of its happening. Part of the incorporation was also to kind of give like a history lesson, right? And I say that because sometimes when you are like, there's a statement that I've said often, but it's really attributed to Dr. James Baldwin, where he said to be African American and to be relatively conscious in America is to be in a state of rage all the time. But imagine a young person who's coming into that kind of consciousness, who's looking around at the conditions that they are under and realizing that, wow, this is here because of redlining. Someone came into our communities, years ago and chopped it up, perhaps with a red marker, calling it redlining. The fact that you have California, Texas, and Mexico right there, but then someone came at some point and said, we're going to carve this out and this is going to be America. And therefore, our family and community that was just right there yesterday, now we have to cross a border in order to see them and visit them. And so that part, I think, had to be described in a very nice way to give a person the understanding that things don't just, like, this is not just, people aren't just poor, especially in the Black and brown community. Part of the perpetuation of poor or poverty, I should say, in the Black and brown community is to allow the person to believe the definition of what we're trying, or what the system is trying to give them. And so they truly become poor because they are poor in the mind, as opposed to being poor because of circumstances.
Yeah, I saw you nodding your head there about the gentrification. Was there something you wanted to sort of add to that?
Yeah, we don't name the city in the book. I think people assume that this is New York City because we're both from New York City. But this is any city, USA. And gentrification, this idea of what was once Black and brown communities, and of course they weren't always Black communities. You have upward mobility amongst African Americans or Black immigrants and white flight. It's not that we came and pushed you out, you didn't want to live around us. And now with gentrification, there are new residents coming in. Now they want to live around us, but not really. So here are the prices going up. Mm-hmm. There are deed theft that is happening in New York City. So you have redlining on one hand, now it's deed theft. So what Yusef said about drawing a line in the middle of where your family lives, and then you have to cross a border to see them. It's bonkers to me. The way that he just put it just now was just like, wow, that is really what happened. And we think about the roads that are built, highways that were built in the middle of Black and brown communities. And those highways went through certain communities and disrupted those communities. And you have two people coming together. Are they going to play nice? Are our children going to play nice when they are observing all of these disparities? So in that night, when punching in the air, there's one heated moment where the boys don't play nice. They don't know how to share because they're seeing grown-ups not sharing. So they are mimicking the behavior in a different way. Adults do it in a civilized way with redlining and deed theft, civilized. And then young people, they fight it out,
Yeah.
So it just suddenly made me think about when you're talking about the redlining, I suppose, of Europe in Africa as well. So sort of carving up the countries and giving them to different European countries. So it feels there's a pattern sometimes for how communities are split and then they'll have to somehow come together and try and heal, not always sort of successfully. I kind of want to talk about creativity now. And there was a little while when I worked for an organisation, an Arts in Prisons organisation, bringing sort of creative writers into prisons and working with a theatre company. And the kind of aim was to work with prisoners that had no literacy or lower literacy, to say that, everybody can tell a story and that everybody's got creativity. And if you can't, doesn't matter if you can't write, somebody will write it for you. And you'd see people transform during that session to think, I can actually do this, when I've been told I can't do this, I'm nothing, but to say they can actually tell a story. And it's actually going back to that classical art, because I was looking through and I think possibly very similar. My mum my mum's a bit of a sort of Anglophile, my stepdad's Italian, so we've always gone to the sort of galleries, we've sort of been to Italy. And I was like looking at your sort of, some of the titles to the poem and some of the references, you've got Da Vinci, you've got Dali, you've got Rodin, you've got Munch's The Scream, Picasso, sort of Guernica. And I thought it was interesting from what you were saying that, at one point, Amal complains that all he gets to look at is old white artists. But at the same time, he recognises and sort of appreciates their beauty. And I was wondering, how, for both of you, how has creativity sustained you through incredibly difficult times? And I'm saying that as a writer, knowing that many other writers in the first 3 months in lockdown in England, we can't do anything. I can't do anything. So but you have got so many things happening in America as well as the virus. How is creativity sustaining you both? And are you managing to be creative? So Ibi, would you like to go first?
Well, growing up in New York City, the more Yusef and I do these talks, the more we realize it was traumatizing. You know how, there's the metaphor that's saying when the fish are in the ocean, they don't recognize the ocean for the ocean, so because violence was so pervasive in our upbringing, New York City, when people think of New York City as a melting pot, but don't know that New York City was incredibly segregated. And 80s New York was violent, but we still played outside and we were still children. But I think subconsciously, we were incredibly creative to make sense of our world. As you know, hip hop started out in the Bronx. In New York City, there was incredible art all around, and that was through graffiti. And we expressed ourselves individually all the time, especially in the 80s, where we had the freedom to do so. And Yusef has a great example of how incredibly creative he was as a teenager. You want to show them, Yusef? So please share that with him. Do you have it around you? Yeah.
Yeah. These were the pants that I wore April 19th, 1989. This is the actual pants that I wore. And of course, this side has some art and different sayings on it. And then, of course, the front is really the big part, because you want, as you're walking down the road, you want people to see what it is that you're doing. And so you have Bob Marley there, and I Choose to Be Fine in 1989 written underneath that with Rastaman Vibration as a part of it. And then, of course, you have on this side, just cool artwork, Dr. Love, this was the type of things that we did. Of course, we couldn't afford Gucci back then. And, you had Dapper Dan creating culture, creating what was hip and things like that. And now he's a part of that expression in today, which is still amazing. But yeah, this was...
Do they still fit?
I don't know. I have not tried them on. These pants have not been washed since 1989. They were taken, right? They were taken from me, and then they were examined. And you had this woman who lost 3/4 of her blood, and so they were trying to, in a similar way, connect us to this particular crime, as they are trying to connect Amal to the crime. And the great thing about it is that Amal's attorney at least has the wherewithal to say, hold on, like, there is no evidence on a skateboard. Why you keep on trying to make it appear as if he physically assaulted this person with a skateboard? That's not what happened, And so in the same way, they were trying to get me and the rest of us to be connected with this crime, even though there was no deoxyribonucleic acid. That DNA was not there that would have sealed the deal.
Charles, as I suppose, represent more than the creativity. It's also a kind of legacy and a memorial, isn't it, as opposed to your youth at that time?
It's interesting. I think most of everything that I have personally is part of that, so to speak, legacy. I still have the shirt. My mother gave it to me. I have the shirt that she wore back in 1989 that said Yusef is innocent. I actually have one of those shirts hanging in my what do they call it? The foyer.
What I want to add that this was, when you're thinking about a child being accused of a violent act, I wonder if they would have thought of to bring psychologists, whoever, to think of those things. This is what this boy is doing to his pants. Look at the detail. Look at the attention to detail. I mean, at what point do you fit in that sort of heinous crime in that process? What are you thinking when you're making art, when you're thinking of wearing something like that outside to be seen, right? You can't miss him wearing those pants, and he had a tall flat top. That's not something you wear when you're going out to wreak havoc on people, So it's one of those things where you're like, was anybody thinking critically at this point?
I think also maybe it's, it's like in the book, is that dissonance. Nobody even sees that. They just see Amal, they see his black skin, and that's it. Anything beyond that, and those monsters and their sort of white imagination, that's what they see. They don't see the creativity, the detail, the sensitivity, all of those things. It's sort of down. And I think that brings it really sort of alive. And I suppose we haven't got much more time. So there's a couple of more things I just wanted to ask. One was about, in a sense, creativity. Two things that sort of art can do. One is it can ask questions, which your book does. It enables, art people to talk and ask questions. But also art can bring people together. And I was just wondering if you're seeing any ways at the moment in current society, in sort of US society, that art might be bringing different types of people together.
Wow, I think art is bringing different types of people together in a very powerful way. So as we've been sitting in our front row seats through social media, for instance, watching the tragedy unfold, right? We also see very beautiful outpourings where murals are being created right in DC, right in front of everything, right? So, that I actually was just at an unveiling this weekend down in Florida. First time, I think it's the first time, I think so, where they created a mural, a Black Lives Matters mural in the parking lot of the church. And then on all of the stops where people park their cars are the names of victims of tragedy. You have Malcolm X, you have Medgar Evers, you have Tamir Rice. I mean, it just goes on. And it's such a beautiful, so to speak, expression. But then it also shows that we all are part of the great artist's work, the creator. And in that expression, unfortunately, we are taught that you should not judge a book by its cover, but we all do it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right? We all do it. Yeah. And I think when racism when oppression is mixed into that, so to speak, thought, wow, this person is this, you then have xenophobia. You know, that's these are not, they're not like us. Mm. We breathe a rare air that they should not be privy to. We're still on the planet. You know, we're all still experiencing humanness. And in that beauty is the human race. And in the human race is the opportunity for the kaleidoscope of the human family to create positive, beautiful things together collectively, as opposed to destruction and war and all of the things that we've seen in history and that are still continuing to play itself out. And so you have people saying that we need change. That change now is coming in the form of young people saying this whole system is not broken, but needs to be completely replaced, you know. And I think that that's part of the beauty of it all.
And I suppose in a sense it is what was happening with the mural as well in the prison, when they sort of worked together to create that mural, with even Stanford in the background clowning around. But also I could imagine that being what he wanted until it gets painted over by the sort of racist, well, not painted over by the racist prison officer, but ever since that he's the one who instigated it. And it felt like this moment of creation where they came together to make something that was very beautiful for everybody. And it felt like I suppose a metaphor, I suppose, for how art can bring people together in very difficult sort of circumstances. I suppose the last thing I want to really think about is hope. And what was interesting, I think, from one of the interviews, you spoke about how you could have anticipated perhaps in the past that you'd write a book that would be read primarily by sort of white librarians and school teachers, because that's the demographic of white female librarians and white female teachers in the US. Very much the same in the UK as well. So I must, say personally that a lot of librarians for us as children's writers in the UK in schools are the ones who really are getting our books into young people's hands and are getting us into schools. And it's Black History Month in the UK at the moment, so there's not many Black writers. So I'll pop onto Twitter and I'm on another board for Black History Month. But that's fantastic because there's many white librarians doing that work for us. So the sort of theme, I suppose, for Book Week Scotland in 2020 is the future. And of course, Amal is hope. So I want to ask you both, how can we pass on hope to future generations? So Ibi, would you like to answer this dissertation of a question?
I think, and I've been rethinking what hope means, because we say it so much yes. That it starts becoming cliche a little bit to me as I say it, right? And I had to think, well, what does that mean? To me, it means that things are not too well right now, but it's to keep going, knowing that it will get better, right? We say this to young people all the time, but it is this idea of not being disillusioned, not being pessimistic. I think that can be dangerous ground when we can see everything that is happening and think that I'm never going to get a job. I'm never going to own a home. I was at a school visit in Cleveland, Ohio, here in the States, and I asked an audience of about 200 teenagers, what is your biggest fear? And a good number of them said getting shot. And statistically, it won't happen, I'm hoping. And I'm thinking of getting shot by the police. I thought that's what they were saying, but that's not what they were saying. They were saying, yes, getting shot by the police, getting shot in my own neighborhood, getting shot at school. So, if we have to go to war, this idea of gun violence is pervasive throughout their lives. So what do I say to kids who think like that? The hope part of it is that you can change it. You can start working on yourself right now. And that self can be whether you're thinking of being an artist, whether you're thinking of being a journalist or a policymaker or a politician or an educator. That is part of the work of changing those things that you fear right now. So to me, that's what hope means. The hope is that I have the skills, I can start working on the skills that will allow me to change things in the future so that it's better for me and the world.
I think that is a good, so to speak, alley-oop for me, in that I was thinking about how to tie in the mural with hope, and Ibi just said it all in such a really profound way. What happened and what happens often in prison is people begin to accept and believe what it is that they are trying to tell them that they are. And that is the word criminal. And so they become criminal. The beautiful thing about this particular mural, as it relates to hope, is that once it is created, there is opportunity. And the opportunity is something that is being born inside of the creator of that particular mural that can never be taken, even though the mural was painted over. And so you want to be able to see it again. But what you have to do is rely on memory and the hope of what you are. Because what happens is that you just began to believe. You believe the possibilities. You realize that they can never paint over the transformation that happened as a result of the participation of the inmates creating that particular kind of expression. And I think that that's the beautiful part, because it's always a fight. It's always a struggle. You're fighting against the ideas that they're trying to give to you of what's the word I'm thinking about? I was going to say self-worth, but I'm thinking about, they're trying to tell you you're not worth anything. But the truth of the matter is that a child is born, and that child was born against great odds. Being one of over 400 million options, that child was born. And the fact that the child is here, thriving, alive, signifies that this is the caretaker of tomorrow. And it behooves us who are wise enough, which this officer wasn't, which he is an example of many. Those who are wise enough are realizing that we have to pour into the child so that the child can take care of tomorrow in a most profound way, in a caring way, in a loving way, in a hopeful way, in a way that provides the insulation we need as a part of the human race to be able to be successful, to be able to create properly, to be able to be.
I suppose it's a great thing that it is actually a hopeful book. So thank you so much for joining me your afternoon and my evening. And I managed to avoid only one police car went by, so that was good. And I just need to just sort of finish off by saying that this this Book Week Scotland event has been brought to you by Scottish Book Trust, and Scottish Book Trust wants everyone living in Scotland to have equal access to books, because better access to books means better life chances. And you can help by gifting a book to a family who is struggling this Christmas. If you've enjoyed this event, and I hope you have, please consider sharing your love of reading with others by making a donation to Scottish Book Trust's Christmas Appeal at scottishbooktrust.com. And thank you so much to our guests on this panel, Ibi Zoboi and Yusef Salaam. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrice.